Welcome back to the NBA Finals preview here on 1140 The Bet. Adrian Hernandez here with someone I've been waiting to talk to for a minute and glad we got him on the show. With us now is Jake Fischer of Bleacher Report. He's also the host of the Please Don't Aggregate This podcast. And apart from being a newsmaker, he's also an author of the book Built to Lose: How the NBA's Tanking Era Changed the League. All insider calls are brought to you by BetQL. Bet smarter and beat the books. Download your BetQL app today or visit BetQL.com. First and foremost, Jake, welcome to the show, and how are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you? Thanks for having me.
No, we doing good. We kind of sad that basketball's going away, at least, on the court. We still got the draft and free agency ahead of us. But as we start this, I want to ask you, and no better person to ask than someone who literally wrote the book on tanking. And it's been interesting, especially this year, when you consider it's been a long path for Boston, but they've kept that core that they've drafted. Golden State, throughout its iterations of being dominant and the surprising team, and throughout this era of Golden State, they've kept their core. And even this season, with surprise teams, whether it was Memphis or Cleveland, Minnesota, some of these teams that were really built by the draft, and as opposed to trying to do the big three mentality. Is that something that was just an oddity this year, or something that you see teams moving on in the future trying to replicate?
One thing that's kind of become a bit of a theme of late around the league is superstar players kind of taking back the power, taking greater agency in requesting trades, trying to get to situations that they find more advantageous for themselves in their career. So I do think that, tanking, rebuilding, trying to build a team organically, that seems to be kind of the team's natural counter effect or counterpunch to that, where, I've talked to a couple Memphis Grizzlies executives this week, for example, and they've talked about how, that building a situation where players would want to stay is something that, they feel like is a competitive fire against, bigger markets like New York or LA or Chicago. So I think that's kind of why potentially we've seen that success, from teams that have built year after year so far in this postseason or not so far, throughout the whole thing, obviously. Teams are really trying to build something that is sustainable, even more so than ever before, with the fear of potentially losing guys in free agency.
And do you think that, like, for instance, Giannis, there was a lot of rumors, or maybe it's just Warriors Twitter, that, like, Giannis is going to go to Golden State, and he still stays in Milwaukee, that some of these things, like you said, Memphis is trying to build something that's sustainable, Milwaukee, Phoenix, some of these smaller markets, like, now more than ever, it doesn't necessarily matter where you are because you can be a superstar wherever.
Yeah, I think, with Giannis, he's a really good example, being that, look, if they didn't win the title last year, there was a really good chance that he did not, re-sign there, or that he would have wanted to force a trade elsewhere. That's kind of the new situation that teams are looking at here, where, Ben Simmons, for example, signs a long-term extension with Philadelphia and turns around and requests a trade pretty, significantly, pretty soon right after. So, but if you can build a winning team, a lot of it comes down to winning. If you can build a winning situation, when the Bucks lose in the second round this year, then it's the talk about, how do we get back to that level? How do we get back to, competing for a championship like they did the year before? So winning is really the ultimate elixir.
Love to hear it. As a small market Cleveland Cavalier fan, I hope we keep winning so we can get some good players. But anyway, I want to move on to the finals, and specifically your moment with Draymond Green after the game, where you asked him about his podcast. Now, even before I realized the next morning, I realized that you were the one that asked the question. I was kind of like, what do you mean? This is something that everyone's wondering about, and it's just interesting and unique. For those that said, why even ask the question, what would be your rebuttal?
So the only reason I asked the question was because I knew Celtics personnel were listening to the contract or to the podcast. So if they weren't, I wouldn't have asked. But the fact that someone like Draymond, who is so touted for his high IQ, is so touted for being a generational, defensive player, the fact that he is speaking unfettered for 30 minutes on a podcast after every single finals game, it's pretty, it's literally an unprecedented thing in NBA history. And it's pretty fascinating to me. Even if he's not giving, insider trade secrets to the other team, he's saying something that's a data point for Boston to think about. And so, I was trying to give him credit for how valuable of a podcast he's putting out there. He clearly heard the word X's and O's and latched onto it and wanted to kind of punch down a little bit, being that, I think a lot of people in the media try to exert their basketball knowledge into a situation rather than asking players questions. But I was just asking. I was asking for him. I was asking for his viewpoint on potentially the thought that Boston people would be listening and gaining at least something of insight from what he had to say.
And like I said, I thought it was completely valid. And also, whether it's X's and O's, it doesn't take much to be bulletin board material, even on the slightest opinion, which is why I was kind of like, why are you being so naive about it? But it is what it is. But I just wanted to give you that moment because I saw a lot of that. And I was literally on Twitter getting into some of these arguments that I probably shouldn't have. And then the next morning I was like, oh, it's Jake. What? But moving on to, what are we? We are 2 weeks away. The June 30th is when free agency opens. And I guess my first question that I want to ask you is probably the most fascinating part of this whole playoffs with the league, which is the situation that DeAndre Ayton is with Phoenix. First and foremost, what was your take, or how do you feel about even just Game 7 of DeAndre only playing, the 16 and 17 minutes, more importantly, getting into that argument with Monty Williams, Coach of the Year, and then now where things stand, where it kind of seems like he's not coming back.
It does, I just put out a story on Bleacher Report right now, a couple minutes ago, that says it does seem like the most realistic landing spots for him are Atlanta, Detroit, and Toronto. I know Portland's been mentioned, but that seems to be like more of a situation where Ayton was a player on Damian Lillard's wish list, if you will. But the Blazers, from my understanding, are expected to retain Yusuf Nurkic as their starting center. So I think for looking at Ayton scenarios, Atlanta, Detroit, and Toronto are the real horses in that race. There's also been some talk of late about a potential sign and trade with Indiana for Miles Turner, but that's definitely getting ahead of ourselves a little bit because those conversations can't happen yet.
And thank you for that. And in terms of everything else going around the league and some of your stories, and I know that I just clicked on your article right now, and you're not lying. It just dropped 3 minutes ago. If you could basically give me just like a short synopsis of what's going on with Philadelphia, which was the bulk of this story that you just released here on Bleacher Report.
So I've been hearing for a while from people around the situation, and then I finally got in touch with some people directly involved this week, that it looks like, James Harden is not going to sign a 5-year or 4-year deal to stick around in Philadelphia. It seems like it's going to be a shorter-term agreement. From my conversations, I'm expecting it to be something like he opts in for next year and then signs a 2-year extension, or he doesn't opt in and then signs a 3-year deal. But I also think he likely will wait until August to fully resign, because then he gets a little bit more money based off of the cap, because they traded for him in February. They have to wait 6 months till after trading for him for Harden to be able to receive 8% annual raises on the contract rather than 5. So that is something I'm expecting to see moving forward here. Outside of Harden, they're definitely exploring Matisse Thybulle, Danny Green trades at number 23, and Tobias Harris is definitely consistently going to be a name that I think we hear about in trade conversations.
Jake Fischer from Bleacher Report joining us. He's the author of Built to Lose, How the NBA's Tanking era changed the league. And he's also the host of the Please Don't Aggregate This podcast. I know recently you had TJ Jones on the show, who covers the Utah Jazz for The Athletic. And the Jazz are another one of these teams that are going to be one of the more interesting situations this offseason here, being so close here in Las Vegas. We have a lot of Jazz fans. So, and Donovan Mitchell kind of flirting in Miami with Jimmy Butler. I thought I was from the understanding that when you look at Rudy and Donovan Mitchell, that Rudy was the easier, quote unquote, easier contract to trade, and Donovan still has 3 years left. So basically, where do we stand with the Jazz right now, and what are they trying to do moving forward?
The Jazz are going to explore a lot of options for Rudy Gobert. I'm not convinced he is actually going to get dealt, but they're definitely talking about him with various teams. From there, it's going to be a matter of if they really do think they find a deal that keeps them in playoff contention, championship contention, and maybe even makes them a bit better. If it's something with Atlanta where they get back Clint Capella and a wing player, or maybe more. Something with Toronto where they get back OG Anunoby. But those are kind of the scenarios that I think make the most sense for the Jazz. But at this point in time, I think it's going to be hard for the Jazz to really find a deal that meets their asking price outside of Atlanta. I think ultimately getting perimeter defense, but also keeping, a real stalwart center, it's going to be a challenge outside of any team that really, besides the Hawks. The Hawks are the most motivated team right now in the league to make pretty sweeping changes. So I think that's kind of the Jazz's best opportunity. With Mitchell, they want him to be the centerpiece of hosting the All-Star game in February in Salt Lake City. That's been made pretty clear to me. And
it's kind of like a Cleveland vibe earlier this year with Darius and Evan and Jarrett, right?
Exactly. And they want to keep him long-term beyond that. So I think ultimately there's going to be, a lot of effort to try to placate Donovan to make him happy, but also with Danny Ainge involved now, I'm really curious to see, the outcome of the coaching search is going to really show us a pretty key data point on how this team is going to be built moving forward as it pertains to Donovan Mitchell and what he, purportedly desires in Utah.
And Jake, we appreciate everything, and I know we're in the middle of the NBA Finals, and you got to get out of here. So just two more quick questions. Number one, for the casual NBA fan who is going to go next week, oh snap, the NBA draft is here. From an outside perspective, what should we expect in terms of, will there be a lot of movement? Are some of these teams going to move up, try to use these picks to pick up good players and make trades and things like that?
Now, I've been saying we're going to see 5 to 7 trades in the first round.
Ooh.
We've already seen 2, where Denver, traded for the 30th pick with Oklahoma City, and last night Dallas traded the 26th pick for Christian Wood to Houston. So that's already 2. We only need 3 more to get to 5. And I definitely think, with Portland looking to move 7, Sacramento's definitely taking calls on 4. Then you got, the Hornets down at 15 are apparently, that pick is available. From there, you got New York looking to move up at 11. Washington said to be listening to call it 10. You go down the list. The Spurs have 3 picks. The Grizzlies have 2. So there's going to be, I think, a ton of movement on draft night. I think a ton of veteran players are going to get moved as well. And it's going to have pretty dramatic impacts on free agency, being that I think this Portland 7th pick and their trade scenarios, that's holding up the Rudy Gay, the OG Anunoby, the Jeremy Grant, the John Collins vortex of all those potential trade candidates. So once that domino falls, it could lead to another ripple effect of potential outcomes.
And Jake, like I said, I'm from Cleveland, so I got to ask you a very specific Cleveland Cavaliers question. Colin Sexton. Specifically with Colin, it's interesting and something that's been brought up through this playoff run. For years, we talk about how Rudy Gobert in the playoffs kind of gets singled out and played off the court because teams game plan to attack him specifically. And in some of the conversations that I'm seeing on the flip side, Colin's an undersized guard, so teams are going to try to attack him. And I think that in this playoff run, it kind of became very evident. And obviously, Colin, can get buckets. And is he willing to kind of take a pay cut or around $10 million to stay in Cleveland? And I know we've heard reports that the Lakers are interested, but I guess what's the latest that you're hearing regarding Colin?
Yeah, I think he's going to have interest in several teams, or from several teams. Detroit and Washington get mentioned the most frequently, but the Cavs do have interest in bringing him back. That number is definitely, between 10 and 15, I think, is a number that the Cavs certainly would like to have him on, being that there's going to be obviously, a very expensive payroll there moving forward. Darius Garland about to get extended, and Evan Mobley will eventually too.
You love to see it.
I think, I think getting Colin on a lower term deal is certainly what the Cavs are hoping for.
Jake Fischer joining us one more time, the author of Built to Lose, How the NBA's Tanking Era Changed the League Forever. He's a newsmaker for Bleacher Report and also his podcast. Please don't aggregate this podcast. By the way, the last month, the guests have been phenomenal. Jake, before we get you out of here, do you have time for one more question?
Hit me, man.
Look, I'm not trying to downplay Boston. They've come down 3-2 two times in a row. Making it 3 times seems extremely difficult. But on the flip side for the Warriors, how does their offseason change depending on if they clinch tonight before Game 6 or on Sunday for Game 7 and win this championship, or if they end up losing to Boston?
Yeah, I don't think much really hangs in the balance for what they're going to do depending on their outcome. I think, Jordan Poole is someone they're going to have to address with his extension. Andrew Wiggins is someone they're going to have to address with his next contract. But this is a team that is fully, designed on competing for the championship around Stephen Curry with Klay Thompson and Draymond Green still in the fold. So that's where things stand, and that's pretty much where everything's going to be.
Jake Fischer, Bleacher Report, joining us, 1140 The Bet Las Vegas. Jake, thank you so much for the time.
Appreciate it. Take care.